You're tuned into RX Radio. Movement prescribed. Brought to you by Prescript.com. A personalized approach to keeping you healthy and making your best even better. Your hosts, Dr. Jordan Shallow and Dr. Jordan Ginta.
I think the craziest thing is this idea that everything is a core movement. Like at its base, we look at the challenge that exists at the core, whether that be antilateral flexion, rotation, flexion, extension, and it's like I look there and I look at all other means of training that movement as perturbations to that. Because I think at the end of the day, the linchpin to training volume, training intensity, training frequency, and the uptake of skill lives and dies at the core when we move to internal stabilization.
Yeah, and then, I mean, that, to expand on that. And hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of RX Radio. Join with me in the shoebox in the sky is El Jefe, Finding Forrester, Sean Connery, Killian Hamilton. So you're catching us mid-stride in the introduction of this podcast to talk about the contents of this podcast. And we're going to probably just end up recording a whole other podcast based off this conversation. But I think to understand the organization of the core as this central resistance of force, which everything distal to that is merely perturbation, until which point there's a unification of forces or a unified ability to resist force from central to peripheral, from proximal to distal, then we can start to maybe isolate the core out of movements and train chest supported or leg presses and things like that. But this idea that to organize that core stability is to organize breathing and walking, or to organize rib cage and pelvis, like depending on, how namaste yogi breathing and walking you want to go, how down the anatomical rabbit hole of rib cage and pelvis, they're one and the same, right? In the conversation of function and structure, there is no difference between a rib cage size and shape and the function of the diaphragm beneath it. So whether your target in analysis and assessment is the structure of the rib cage, whether your target analysis is efficiency of breathing mechanics, they are the same thing, right? And the superimposition of structure and function of the shoulder, not necessarily the same, right? I can look at someone's shoulder and maybe try to anticipate how that person moves. Such an ability to outfunction the structure because it's so much function over structure. Hip, to a lesser but albeit still greater degree than the rib cage and the pelvis, has an ability to present a certain way structurally, but perform a different way functionally. When we go look to these core tenets, to your sort of first principle of organizing movement as perturbation to proximal rigidity, to give McGill his due on that quote, because I think there's some validity to that, is to understand that, look, the rib cage and pelvic function and structure is the same. If you're looking at structure, it's like the crazy guy in Patch Adams. You're actually seeing the function. If you're looking at function, you're seeing the structure. And to me, and as we apply this in today's episode across the skill acquisition model, this is one of, and we've had however many thousands of conversations now on and off the internet. This is probably my favorite conversation we've had about training. I
think so, and I think what's not seen behind the skill acquisition course that's coming out and behind the skill acquisition conversations we have is this is going on 18 plus months of talking about this. Yeah. This started literally from hey, you think it's art versus habitude was the first discussion, right? Do you think mastering movement is like art versus the habitude, which is trying movement, to now we're talking about perturbations to movement and schemas and cognition and perception and rib cage and core. So I think it's you're seeing, not only are you seeing us describing exercise in isolation as we are and trying to contextualize it, but you're seeing now us trying to contextualize an 18-month conversation that it itself has gone through a cognitive, associative, and autonomous phase of us doing it.
This is a meta conversation.
Yeah, very much so.
Well, it's crazy because we've been talking about it almost on a daily basis for, almost 2 years now. But each one of those conversations has come to the table with a decade of previous conversation with ourselves. Yeah. But I was like, oh, you talk about yourself, or you talk to yourself about this stuff all the time, don't you? It's like, hi, do you want to be friends? Yes. Okay, because it's hard, because and the cool part about, Prescript and RX Radio and that is we've somehow just thrown this crazy shit out in the world, and we've found a bunch of people that are like, oh my God, I've been talking with myself and the four walls in which I live about the same thing. You guys are talking to each other about it. That's incredible.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about that because no one else seems to care. And like, look, to a certain degree, rightfully so. But if you like training, I think this conversation is the most fundamental conversation you can have around first principles of training, period.
I think so.
And we pulled it out of our ass at 8 a.m. in the morning. Good one. Fuck yeah, man. Skill acquisition course.
Yeah.
Super excited. It's a big one.
It's crazy,
It
man.
is crazy. It's wild. I like it because it doesn't exist.
Yeah. That's the cool thing to me is like, number one, this is obviously something I'm very passionate about. And number two, it doesn't exist because it exists before everything else exists. Like,
Right.
you have an idea and you take skill acquisition. All it is a way of laterally thinking about your idea in a more contextualized, organized fashion.
It's a meta idea.
Yeah.
Right? Like, no idea exists without this story being told first, which is so cool to me. And the fact that it as a course doesn't exist elsewhere, the fact that, like, you know, I did this with the level 1. Like, I have an idea. And now it's like, it's a thing, kind of, right? Like, someone messaged me, Night of the Living Deadlift, a.k.a. Willie Parfait. Shouts out Willie Parfait. I say Parfait because I'm Canadian. If he's American, it's probably...
Parfait.
Is it Parfait? It's Parfait forever now. He is a yogurt snack for the rest of his life. But someone was like, oh, man, I was wearing my Prescript shirt in the Stanford gym. And, like, 2 guys came up to me and stopped me. I was like, oh, no fucking way. But, like, to see now hey, man, I have an idea.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Dope. What is it? That's a fucking great idea. Now it's already a thing. It's more of a thing than my thing. But clearly, like, the conversation we have, I think, you know, we look at some of the anatomical principles with the level 1, but this being a meta idea, the idea, like, this is like the singularity idea of training. It's like, from this, everything stems. And if it doesn't stem from this, it's not worth doing.
Yeah, it's really cool because it's like we did a podcast on thoughts and like we just flamed people. But the skill acquisition course, you describe it way better than I do. You call it like the death of 10,000 hours. I think of skill acquisition as not only the death, but birth of thoughts. It's both the death and birth of Superman.
God, it's like the phoenix rising from the middle.
Is.
Yeah, but I think because, like, as I sort of alluded to, like in the sentence previous, it was like without this, the things that exist within this are worth existing. The things that don't aren't, and that's the idea of the phoenix story. However, whatever you fucking creation, Enuma, Elish, whatever you want to read, the idea of death and rebirth. Whether it's Jesus in the tomb for 3 days, whatever, don't care what books you read. I do care what books you read. But, like, shedding, and I think this allows people, and we talk about this a lot in the episode, allows people to, like, when does this stop mattering? When does the end of hyper specificity and oversimplification, where are those points? And I think skill acquisition as a means of epistemology, a metacognition, a meta thought process around how and what you learn, I think it's such a, I don't want to say comforting, but it is such a process that builds confidence in your conviction that, look, past this point, past cognitive, past autonomous, there is nothing that exists. These are the outer borders. These are the, you know, the first principles in which we operate, right? This is the meta thought that governs sort of the universe of training. And I think that's really when we look through closely and to speak with people who've gone through Prescript courses in the past, that's what we're after. We're after confidence and conviction.
Yeah, like I described my job the other day on a podcast as I facilitate the bandwidth for smarter people. And the skill acquisition course is only going to facilitate people's bandwidth to be better.
Yeah, it's the conduit for people to think. Right, it's not telling them what to think, which is, I think, a cornerstone of what we do. Right, is like the first line of every single semester of every course in person is like, look, I'm not here to give you all the answers. I'm here to help you ask better questions. Right, if you're running the Bell fiber optic, it's like, look, old training methodologies are giving you fucking dial-up. Right, like the internet doesn't give you the answers. You have to ask the questions, and you can ask, you know, how to learn quantum physics in the internet, and if you know how to ask the right questions, you can learn it, right? So, like, this course, and I think probably more so than any course we have, allows you to improve that upload and download speed of what it is you're getting rid of and what it is you're intaking, right? What it is you're burning off, what is the death and rebirth of your thought process. So coming out the other end of it, we talk about Rene Descartes, which is obviously what we're going to talk about in the fitness podcast. What you're left with in that distillation process, you are 100% confident in. And I think that's where trainers end up going too far in the hyper-specific and the hyper or the oversimplified, right? They end up going to these extremes where there's just no one living there anymore. So they can just do whatever they want. They can pull some Om Shinrikyo cult shit just because everyone's like, what are you doing over there? Like, all right. And a couple people are like, oh, what's going on over here? I don't know what I'm doing either. That guy's like the leader of not knowing what he's doing. But so I think to be like formidable, especially in today's day and age where it's like, it's so hard to weed through the crap of this 200-meter army crawl, Shawshank shit fucking marathon. You got to get free of yourself in a place with your business where you can actually kind of sit on the beach with Andy Dufresne and crack a cold one. It's like you have to be confident in your convictions. And I think the parameters of the skill acquisition course give you that supreme confidence of like, look, this is the outer borders of what matters. This is the conduit in which to paint those straight lines between these borders, whatever fucking way you want. You want to go pro golf, you want to go high lie, you want to go bodybuilding, you want to go whatever. This is the roadmap. Yeah. Pumped, dude. Yeah, January 18th. K-Ham on the ones and twos, dishing it out. Registration live, www.pre-script.com. Hit that courses tab. By the time this episode is up, it'll likely be on, or it will be on the main page. So if you get prescript.com, it'll be there. Shoot us if you guys want, talk more, ask questions at Killian Hamilton, at _muscle_doc. We talk about whatever you guys want to know about the course. Shoot you the link from there. But take the time. We don't ever ask people to share episodes. We do appreciate when like they do the Instagram thing. We try and repost it. Tag at RX'D Radio, at Prescript, Killian and myself. I think if there's one podcast that would sum up what this podcast is about, it's this one.
Yeah, I think this is it.
Pumped, man. All right, guys, enjoy the episode. Again, Killian Hamilton, skill acquisition, January 18th, prescript.com. We'll see you guys there, and again, enjoy the episode. Because it's like drawing the line between like far left and far right. Like it's easy to go like, okay, once we start talking about like supreme races, we've gone too far right. Like this ship has sailed. But with exercise, it's just like there's no line for the hyper complexity. Like at a certain point, variables cannot possibly be like clinically or statistically or clinically significant in the sense that that past a certain level of execution competence, after a certain level of depth of programming, there has to be a line in which any further exploration is purely in the realm of the academic and not in the realm of the applied.
Yeah, I think part of that comes from like classifying movement. So I think one way like we look at movement in Prescript, or I look at movement in programming, is like I look at knee flexion, hip extension, protraction, retraction, depression, elevation, and those become like the merits from which I choose or classify movement. So I think from that regard, there you begin to paint the edges of where you go, because there are definitives to those parameters, right?
Right.
30 degrees relatively of hip extension. Knee flexion is going to look a certain way with, like deep knee flexion, deep hip flexion is going to look a certain way. So with that, you start to get these more defined parameters, and I think you start to paint out the the obscurity in movement.
Yeah, because I think at a certain point, like I always think of the Turkish Get-Up. That's where I draw the line. Anything past this, you shall not.
Yeah.
Right. And so I just think of each one of those like subcomponents of the movement has, in each level or layer of the movement, has a particular like criteria that we could break down. But like if we're looking at upward, downward rotation or elevation, depression, retraction, protraction, or shoulder flexion, abduction, internal rotation, all these things, all these different movements in isolation. At what point is there a meta-defining criteria where it's like, okay, let's take a Turkish Get-Up, does appease some of these movements, at what point are there too many cooks in the kitchen, right? Like at what point is this just security through obscurity? Because I think it's without a definitive line of like, look, how compound is compound? Like how complex, how multi-joint is too multi-joint? right? Like, where do we draw the line? And like, definitively, okay, this, anything further into the realm of the ethereal past this exercise is you're splitting the atom. You're doing this purely for some sort of academic purpose to see what the body would react in doing this, and we're not actually deriving an adaptation, right? It's just, where do I think people struggle, because it is like this bottomless pit, this bottomless pit, that it's just like, well, I don't need to go deep on anything, because I can go extensively and never-endingly wide with my exercise selection.
Yeah, like, so I was talking about this yesterday on a call that I had, and I think we were discussing like landmine pressing movements, and how I don't consider the landmine press a shoulder movement, because I don't see it like that. What I see when I look at a landmine press is I see the conversation between the rib cage and the pelvis, and I really see it as like a core movement. The perturbation of that movement is this degree of shoulder flexion or shoulder extension, external rotation. So I see what the shoulder's doing in the landmine press as a perturbation to maintaining whatever I choose to maintain at the trunk. So when we're looking at, like you're saying, like not going to the obscure, I think there's like shapes that we appease based on these movements we've deemed primal or basic or kind of base level movements, that when we move outside of those shapes, we now lose transferability. Like, I can create perturbation to any movement within a lunge or a squat or a hip extension moment or a hinge movement, and that becomes a perturbation to that skill of hip extension, as long as the shape of hip extension remains. Now, if I start to create a shape that I can't transfer or adapt to, the Turkish Get-Up, where I really spend no time in any defining movement that appeases knee flexion, hip extension, shoulder flexion, whatnot, then that transferability is lost, then this movement is obscure to me. So I kind of look at these base level shapes and how I can create perturbations to those shapes without ever losing like that basic shape, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the Turkish Get-Up is, for me, like my line in the sand. It's funny because I went off on some rant, as I often do, about just the inane thought process that must be behind someone who programs the Turkish Get-Up. And then the next day, Squat University, 5 exercises all athletes must do, top of the list, Turkish Get-Up. Like, fuck, what athlete? Like an athlete that competes in a Turkish Get-Up competition? Because like my problem is when you perform the exercise and you can clearly identify maybe 4 or 5 different shapes or patterns, right? There's the protraction, there's the trunk rotation, there's the unilateral like hip mechanics that are like the walkthrough, and then whatever kind of getting to the standing position, anti-rotation through the trunk, this whole 9 yards. But say, for example, like you got to a point where, because there's a compounding effect of minor inabilities to be able to perform or maintain the shapes that within it, and then there's a compounding negative effect that for every time you try to adopt a new shape, the compounding effects of minor inefficiencies of shapes previous leave you at a further disadvantage to express or build upon the function of the next shape.
Yes.
Which is like, you could be like, let's break it down into maybe 4 major components. And you could be a rank order 4 out of 5 on all of them. But by the time you get to the last one, your ability to express your 4 out of 5, capacity or potential of that particular joint is actually limited now to like a 2 theoretically. Because you've compounded so much inefficiency in your next position based off of just a subtle inability to, which would be non-significant in any other pattern, right? Like, and I think a lot of like the hyper like vigilance around creating this obscurity, like we see this in movements that don't need to be examined as much as they are. Mm-hmm. And Squat University is a great example of going too deep. Like when we see the 2-dimensional, I talk about this, we just finished the first week of level 1, and one of the first things we talk about is like the 4 dimensions of programming, right? Does this fit through the 3 dimensions of movement, and where does it fit in the dimension of time? Right, like if I see a knee knock in on like a beginner client, it's like, okay, maybe that pelvic instability, maybe lateral hip stability. This understanding that 4th dimension is like to understand that knee knocking in is something that we're going to want to fix. But when Klokov hits the hole with a 160 kilo snatch and that knee comes in, I can see the progression of time as a dimension in training, and all of a sudden that little stick figure that Squat University puts up and go, here's your hip, here's your knee, here's your ankle, that's valgus, no bueno, is like, dude, I put up a quote, I talked about it the other day, and one of the coaches reposted it. that tyranny is the willful removal of nuance. And it's like a weird tyranny is like, especially in this day and age, it's like people getting their barbecue joint shut down for just being open. It's weird to talk about like tyranny from like a training standpoint, but it is like it is a purposeful removal of nuance. And when we start to see people remove literally like the dimension of the transverse plane, which you can't see rotation in a stick figure, and then the removal of time, it's like we're looking at 2 to 4 dimensions. You're looking at this movement through a fucking paper towel roll, right? How can you derive anything from it? But we can make these very black and white arguments about training because we're not seeing the whole picture, and it's a lot of times we're purposefully blinding ourselves to things that actually create this reversion to the mean. It's like, look, if we look at all these dimensions and think of all the ways this could go wrong throughout time and within space, it doesn't matter.
Well, I think something too is like when we see this hypervigilance, like you said, towards things that don't need to be examined, I think they often come from sources or come at times when like there's an option to progress someone or there's the option to regress someone. And if you don't have the tools, if you're not enabled with the tools to progress an athlete, the easiest thing to do is regress them because it doesn't show your inability to progress them. If you have to coach Klokov from a 160 kilo snatch to a 165 kilo snatch, that's incredibly difficult. This guy's in the upper echelon of athlete. Well, what's easier than making him stronger? Finding a weakness and taking him off the tool that he uses to go do something that's not exactly what he needs to do, but is a new skill to adapt to, right? Like skill acquisition, like client acquisition is the most expensive thing, right? In business, client acquisition costs far more than client retention. Well, when we look at programming, skill acquisition costs the athlete and the coach far more than, skill retention costs an athlete or a coach. So when you're looking at somebody who's going to pick apart a high-level athlete and go, oh, their knee comes in, well, to go move over to skill acquisition, that's an expensive endeavor for both people that they can now spend a lot of time on and ignore the fact that the person's not getting stronger. Yeah. And this is where we see that deviation from success and failure criteria to a new metric that doesn't matter, right? People join a gym because they want to lose 40 pounds. They can't lose weight. All of a sudden, they love getting strong. You know what I mean? But they're still overweight. So it's just they found a new metric. And I think, dude, I see that in coaching all the time where somebody has a high-level athlete who they can't make stronger, and they go, oh, we're going to take a step back and we're going to improve your function. It's like, well, no, just make him stronger. He's there.
Yeah.
Whatever function that you're seeing doesn't matter at this point. It's the shape of the sport.
It's like making Charles Barkley a better golfer.
Yeah.
It's like homie's like 280, go hard in the paint. Yeah. Doesn't matter if he swings like Bob Barker and fucking in Happy Gilmore. And he's a terrible golfer, but he's a great basketball player, right? And to understand that, look, like the skill of whatever, and a lot of times, especially in strength and conditioning, like to understand that, like you said last time we were here, like let the weight room do weight room things, let biceps do bicep things, and let baseballs do baseball things. Right, like to understand that the skill of the objective outcome, if it's not inside the gym, needs to be practiced outside the gym. Now, and if we can just build, we can expand on our skills within the parameters of things we do in the gym, then the transferability will come on the field.
Yeah, and it's like I like how you mentioned like the removal of nuance, because I think we see that removal of nuance in people's thought process and in people's programming, and that's when we start to see like the unnecessary exercises that are created, or we see the unnecessary assessments that are made on people. Like the Turkish Get-Up exists in a program written by somebody who doesn't compete at a sport, because it's just like, well, let's just throw this crazy hard thing in, and now we don't have to do something that's probably more transferable but harder to program. Like, do you really need to do a Turkish Get-Up if you understood like every possible way of loading and progressing a rear foot elevated split squat or a B stance RDL? Probably not, because like I can buy 16 weeks of programming with the rear foot elevated split squat and the B stance RDL. I don't need to introduce this inane movement in there to kind of buy myself time to jump onto the next base level programming adaptation. Like,
yeah, I just think with assessments, like, and that's, we're always assessing. Like, we can talk about assessments being this longitudinal process. Like initially, if we're looking at assessment of the shoulder or the hip, it's like, do we have the mobility or stability or variability or capacity to get into a shoulder flex externally rotated position with a neutral rib cage? do we have the ability to get into extension, internal rotation of the hip with the neutral pelvis? That's it. That's all I think we need to, from an initial onset, as far as, like, as you would say, create the environmental constraints around movements in which we're going to start to paint a circle around this straight line. That, I think, is like the two biggest criteria we need to look at peripherally is flexion, external rotation of the shoulder, neutral rib cage, extension, internal rotation of the hip, neutral pelvis. We can maintain that. We have our peripheral hubs, we have our central hubs. Everything is coexisting in a way that we should be able to introduce load within an active range, period. That should be, for non-pathological clients, the end of your variability or mobility stability assessment. Like, because I think the problem is, and I see this a lot in a clinical setting, is people confuse themselves by asking questions in which the answers to those questions will not change or shouldn't change the thought process. Like, to me, an MRI is a question, an X-ray is a question, a CT or diagnostic ultrasound is a question. But before I ask the question, and I do this with people all the time, anyone who's ever been in a relationship, anyone who's ever been in a relationship with me, I do not ask questions that I don't need the answers to.
Yeah.
I am a speak when spoken to kind of individual, other than on a podcast, but people keep listening, so I'm assuming that they want us to keep talking. But it's like, I don't sit there and try and inquire, like we talked about this months ago, and it's something I've been thinking about. The arbitrary collection and construction of this repository of useless information.
Yeah.
Like I think, which is weird, people don't ever think about thinking. And we talk with Benny in Tampa about, like, I sit and I think until I start thinking, or like that idea of, you know, your brain is just sort of like off into whatever. It's like I have enough shit to think about before randomly inquiring about stuff that doesn't matter. Right? That's why, like, I hate people like that you're sitting there talking to them and like, oh, like, what was that guy in that movie? I'm like, I don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
Like, what movie? It doesn't matter. If you don't know, it doesn't matter. Like, what else could you have been spending that mental energy on? And it's just like, for me, with assessments, people keep, like, they pull magic tricks on themselves. Like, oh my God, how did I pull the rabbit out of that hat? It's like, why do you have a rabbit and a hat? You're a trainer. Like, it doesn't matter. It's just, for me, like, the idea that if you are going to, like, from a question on an intake form to an advanced image, blood draws, MRIs, CTs, to asking someone what time it is, I don't give a fuck because I don't have anywhere to be. A wizard is never late. I arrive exactly when I mean to, right? So it's just, I hate this idea. And I'm dealing with this now with a company that I'm consulting for. It's like, we'll just throw it in there. It's like, no, man, like a distillate. I love this place. I love coming here because this is Killian distilled. This is it. This is you. From the Versace slides to the fucking 10,000 books to the 10,000 records. Nothing that is here does not get used.
Yeah.
And that's your brain. Then that's how I think. Because I don't think people have a metacognition.
No.
Like, people don't think about how they think.
So, like, a question I get, I hate when people say this. A lot of people have asked me this question and no one asked them questions. Frankly, people ask me too many questions. But a question, anytime I post a Q&A, people say, how can I get better at critical thinking? Oh, what's a good resource for critical thinking?
The irony in that is so like, funny to me.
Yeah, it's the cringiest question. Super cringe. But I've distilled it down to this. When I think, the first thing I think about is everything I already know before I ask a question. If there's something that I'm like, oh, I want to ask this question, the first thing I do is I stop and I go, what the fuck do I already know about this? And I answer as many questions as I can. And if there's actually a question remaining, the question is probably very hyper-specific and efficient to ask someone else.
It's dualism. It's René Descartes.
Yeah.
I think therefore I am, right? Because he literally did the same thing. He had to dispense with everything he thought he knew, right? And what he was left with was that statement, I think, therefore I am. That was the only thing he was certain of. But it's like, that's so profound to me, of like, but I think it's funny that I brought up the Google search who was in that movie, because every single time someone does that, they never remember who was. So I was driving in here and I made the Finding Forrester reference because that's exactly who you are, except you look into the mental hospital rather than being in the mental hospital. But it was like, I sat with that. I started doing the story and I was like, I was just like, oh, this like crazy guy who sits in a shoebox in the sky. I'm like, oh, that reminds me of that movie. What was that movie? And before I went to Google to search Sean Connery movie sits in apartment, I just sat with it for like 5 minutes. I was driving on the Gardner. I was like, what was that movie? And I thought about everything I knew. I thought about every Sean Connery movie I could think of. And then through this distillation process, I was able to think myself, because I've seen Finding Forrest, great movie, by the way. R.I.P. Pour some out for the homie. That's a loss, man.
Don't beat your wife, though.
2020's been, well, hey, he did some good things. We did some bad things. You're not a patron saint either. You're buy crazy ass like Versace slippers. Get out of here with this nonsense. But point being is like, I did what you said you do inadvertently, but because I think that is one of the foundations of critical thinking. I did not outsource it to Google.
No.
And I don't outsource questions to you unless I've gone through my repository and I'm in my Dewey Decimal System in my brain. Bupkis. Came up with nothing. Yeah. What do you think? And that's why, like, we did the Thoughts podcast. Over under how many, like, 100 over under on DMs, how many people wrote thoughts after?
Oh, dude, over.
But it's one of the things you said was like, look, we do that because we both know that before that question gets asked, there is a scanning of every random bookshelf in our brain, every back dusted memory, every whatever, and we've come up with nothing. Hey man, what do you think? What's in your repository of information? It's just so, I don't like to use the word lazy, but I think it's such a byproduct of the times.
Very much
where it's like we've externalized this repository of information to either the internet or to other people. And it's like, dude, there's no retention. There's no retention of that. And I think that's why, like, I love how you use that business example of like acquisition versus retention, because you see the same thing in people's thought processes. Is like, look, now all of a sudden the price of retention is high.
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't internalize. And I would argue that if the price of retention is high, you are not actually acquiring the skills you need. Right? Because it should be, once you know it, like, there are people you could handcuff and they could beat you in a boxing match.
Yeah.
Right? Because they just know how to make this work. So, but people who don't know, who can't do that, don't have that, they haven't acquired the skills, whether it's like physical skills of training through like the skill acquisition model. But what I love about that model is that it transfers training.
Yeah.
This is learning how to learn. This is epistemology, right? Which is like, I think too many people worry about like creating this useless repository of information, and they try to learn everything, where they don't even learn how to learn. So they're constantly in this like acquisition retention limbo, and then when the rubber hits the road and there's someone in front of them and they need to come up with an answer, or they need to come up with an exercise or a critique, they got nothing.
Yeah, it's because a lot of the questions that I get, at least when people ask them, or that I see people that ask questions or want to learn, is they learn in isolation of something. Like they're hyper-specific to a lift. They're hyper-specific to a fault that someone has in their lifting. They're hyper-specific to a goal. And they're not learning something. They're not learning something in its like base principles or it's in its founding idea and then contextualizing it. They're learning something in context. And it's not about learning in context, but applying context to what you've learned. And that's kind of like the idea of like cognitive associative autonomous, right? It's like, I'm going to do the cognition step, right? I'm going to start to adapt to like, I see, I assess, I react. And then based on that reaction, then I can fall into like associative and then autonomous, right? It's like, I see and I assess, I react to what I see and assess, therefore I'm going to associate it with this, and I'm going to react autonomously this way, right? It would be no different than waiting to cross the road, right? You're sitting, you're waiting to cross the road, you see a car coming, you assess the speed in which it's coming to you, you react as to whether I'm going to step off the curb or not step off the curb. Now, if you have a dog or a small child, you then associate a car with danger, the speed the car's coming with whether or not you should cross the road, and then you repeat it. You take your dog on an hour walk and you do as many crosswalks as you can with your dog and make them sit and stay. You take your kid to as many crosswalks and make them stop and check, look left, look right again, and then cross the road, right? So it's cognitive associative autonomous, and I think that's that's not learning something in context, but that's learning something and applying context to it, right? Because then that person can apply the context of something coming at you fast to any situation and something coming at you fast. But people learn that cars come at them fast and then they step in front of a train. It's like, all right, different vehicle, same situation, man. And like, that's what it comes to learning is people ask questions in such specificity that that same person will ask me relatively the same question a week later, but the modality will change. Yeah. And it's like, dude, we already went over this. Like, what are the tenets of stability? Deviation of center of mass, removal of base of support. And it's like, this is just a different limb. It's a different movement. The same tenets apply. Yeah. Progressive overload still applies. Like, we don't have to repeat the question with every lift, but somebody learns it in such isolation that they only understand those tenets as they apply to that movement.
Yeah, I just think what I like about that model of learning is it is lateral. And I think it is people who are smart, and it's like intelligence, I think, comes in various degrees. Like, you can watch people organize movement and, they might have a 64 IQ, but it's like you can watch some people move and you're like, there's an intelligence here. There's an ability to go through that cognitive associative autonomous, that interpretation, that recognition of the reaction. And like, I just think people don't think laterally. One of the best compliments I think I can give to someone, or the people that I think I surround myself with, regardless of discipline, are lateral thinkers. Yeah. Right? Like, they don't read the book of Matthew in the Bible to just think of like, man, God was kind of crazy. Like, Old Testament shit was like on another level. They think like, okay, there's an interpretation to be had. How can I start to cross apply this? Like, they're not biblical scholars. Yeah. Right? But they can use this model to then start to they can associate it across the board, right? You'll be talking, like Marcus is a great example of this. Like, you talk to Marcus Leone, and here you have this massive human being who's I still don't understand what he does.
Yeah, I don't really know either.
Appraisals, something, bulls, bears, markets, whatever, people from Connecticut, and it's just like, but he'll start talking about one thing, like maybe in the religious realm, but he's applying it to training, or he's applying it to relationships, where it's like people who just learn religion for the sake of learning religion just apply it in religious context, rather than applying context to it, which is like, the nice thing about this model is it so clearly moves laterally. Yeah. Right. And it's just, I think the idea that people cannot think laterally, that like, oh, unilateral load here versus unilateral load here, shoulder, hip. It's like, these are two separate questions, like a factor analysis, this idea of like a distillation of like, you see factor analysis in personality types like openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and neuroticism. That big five is like, if you ask someone who's not really initiated with personality types, like what are personality, and you ask 100 people, you might get 100 different personality like traits. Yeah. Right? Oh, someone's happy, someone's joyful, someone's kind. It's like, are those three traits or are those one trait? Yeah. Right? Like, and that's what like this, I think, when we look to kind of circle back to the initial point, when we look at the obscurities of movement, can we create a factor analysis down to like these core first principles of movement? Yeah. Shoulder flexion, extension, external rotation, internal rotation. But I think, and I don't want to go too far afield here, but I think a line has to be drawn on an oversimplification. 100%. Right? Because, and like, I'm going to catch some heat for this, but I think there's a willful removal of nuance on both ends of hypersimplification and hypercomplexity, right? So, we look at shoulder flexion, external rotation, and a neutral rib cage position. That to me is a benchmark starting point, and start to load the shoulder with maybe instability and unstable positions, and then you can add resistance to the end of that. But this idea, and we haven't really talked about this on the podcast, but the idea that there's only the transverse plane and everything is just compression and expansion, I think is an oversimplification it is a willful removal of nuance to the oversimplified. And don't get me wrong, like the PRI model that's often kind of espoused now, and I think it carries with it some good things, just as hypercomplexity has a potential to carry with it some good. But I think trainers need to worry about the breadth of their boundaries, and so they can start worrying about the depth of their application, right? Yeah. Because like when the way you index exercises, makes the most sense in creating depth and application. Like you can
Yeah.
take a 16-week program, and between B stance RDL and like, you know, Bulgarian split squat, you can program very different adaptations or very different stimulus to derive adaptations across 16 weeks, right? So I think, you know, we can look at Turkish Get-Up as hyper complexity, but I think we need to look at some anatomical models as hyper simplification. The idea that we just move through this compression and expansion and everything is just movement through the transverse plane is like, no, my shoulder still flexes.
Yeah.
There might be a reciprocal rotational component to it, but I still need to respect the flexion moment at the shoulder as an independent variable. Now, do I need to, you know, respect the shoulder in the Turkish Get-Up? It's like, well, maybe the Turkish Get-Up is muddying the waters and we're complicating this first principle of movement.
Like, I think, like, when I look at the Turkish Get-Up, I look at it like the conventional deadlift. Like, it's...
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying.
It's a display of function. Like, you want to see if someone can do all of the 4 tenets that I just gave you.
Yeah.
Hip extension, knee flexion, protraction, retraction, elevation, depression. You want to make them do it all at once? Turkish Get-Up. You know how many times they have to do it? Once.
Yeah.
And then fuck off.
Yeah.
It's like a heavy conventional deadlift. Like, I'm taking a movement that expresses possibly ultimate function of the core, of the lats, of the hips, of terminal knee extension, of breathing dynamics in a hinged position with maximal load, the maximal load I can give you in the gym. You do it once and then go away.
Yeah.
Go away. Like, do an RDL. You want to not do a Turkish, you want to do a Turkish Get-Up once, then do B stance RDL. Then do unilaterally loaded bridge press. Then do, you know, long gait stride walking lunge with like a unilateral dumbbell load. Do all those things and then come back and do one Turkish Get-Up. And then we can check it off the list. But it's like the hip airplane. Like, no, the progression of hip airplane is not 2 dumbbells. The progression of hip airplane is a better exercise.
I laugh so hard when I see you repost. Well, you don't do it as much anymore, but I follow people who tag you in it. Every hip airplane, I've created a monster.
You really have,
It's
man.
so funny to me.
And somehow I'm paying for it.
Oh, dude, you're at the gates for me, man. I appreciate you out there
Yeah.
taking the shots, but it's again like it comes back to skill, right? Because there is this. That's going to be the fucking title shot for the episode. Just the pinch of the bridge of the nose. But I mean, it does come back to skill because we can look at a conventional deadlift and we can see a lower barrier entry of skill than a Turkish Get-Up. But then which of those, if I'm to test a supreme transferable within the lines of hyper specificity versus oversimplification, which one of those is more pertinent to me? The fucking deadlift.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because there's going to be such a or such a learning curve in coordinating these movements where it's like, this is more economical. Like, I am not going to ever find myself in a position where the Turkish Get-Up execution will make or break anything in my life. The deadlift, very different story. Yeah. Right? Like, you know, the scapular mechanics, like the organization of the pelvis, the breathing, the hinge position, all of these things, this is a transferable skill set. Like, this is going to be the outer limits, I think, of like hyper complexity or over complexity that we need, right? Like, this is where we draw the line. Anything past this is a means of assessing like global function. I think we can kind of do away with it.
And I think too, like training economics, like you and I talked about this on a lab, and I said when it comes to doing like seal row, and I see people set a seal row up at the gym, I've already finished my workout because it's not an economical exercise to ever set up if you don't have like the seal row bench.
Yeah.
Well, Turkish Get-Up, regardless of if all of these amazing components are involved in the Turkish Get-Up, by the time you do one fucking rep of that exercise, I've had a client go through a giant set of unilateral bridge press, contralaterally loaded B stance RDL, and ipsilaterally loaded rear foot elevated split squat. And they've done 6, 12, 25. And you're still over here on your second rep of Turkish Get-Up. Guess what? My athlete's at the finish line. fuck you.
And the number of times that, like, let's break down the three shapes of those movements, right? The B stance, the split squat, and the unilateral bridge press. When you do those in succession, the number of reps practicing the skill to the threshold of competency in which the adaptation will be an improvement of the skill for each one of those shapes.
Yeah.
In the amount of time it takes to, I don't know, maybe it takes 6-7 seconds a rep on a Turkish Get-Up. Well, with the eccentric being one, maybe longer, maybe 10-12 seconds.
Yeah.
I've never timed it. Like, and if you're doing, I don't know, 30 to 45 second sets, depending on tempo, you are going to literally just be able to practice and more importantly, learn. Right? You're going to be able to learn those patterns more efficiently because they are not beholden to the execution based off, or that the execution of that shape is not necessarily beholden to execution and competency of shapes previous, right? So it's almost like the bodybuilding volume question of like, who does more work? Work is force times distance. Who has solved for a greater, a greater yield in that equation, right? Like, who has practiced more anti-trunk rotation or, anterior oblique sling with the unilateral press or posterior oblique sling with the ipsilateral or contralateral load in the split squat. And it's just like, if you just took into consideration like the stimulus and the derived adaptation from the stimulus and think of it from a learning perspective, right? Like the idea, I would look at it like studying for a test, right? And there's a podcast that if you guys are interested in, a gentleman named Luke Tulloch. We've had him on the show before. We're definitely going to try and get him on again. And he talks about interleaving as a strategy behind learning. And you think about it in a practical sense, where it's like, if I'm studying for a test, the cramming method does not allow me to retain information, right? And the price of this retention really makes you wonder what it is you're paying for up front when you attempt to acquire this information. And that's really what movement is learning to a large degree. So if I'm looking at learning something, let's say I use guitar as an example, as Luke does the same. I can play for an hour a week, and my first 30 minutes are good. The second 30 minutes, I just play Smoke on the Water because my brain and my fucking sausage fingers just can't make it happen anymore. So I get 30 minutes of the good practice a week and 30 minutes of shit practice, which affects how my brain learns the good practice. If I go 15 minutes every other day, I'm going to do exponentially more work and more learning throughout the course of the week, right? It's like the bro split. Chest, back, shoulders, arms, legs. Okay, you do 20 sets of each. You really probably only do 12 by the time you've done your warm-up sets on every exercise. You maybe do 12 working sets, and that's generous. But if you did full body rotations, you could probably get, 16 to 20 real sets in a week, and then that's going to be the superlative training style for hypertrophy because you've just been able to do more work, right? So I think the same thing applies, is how much effective learning is a Turkish Get-Up going to afford you versus taking three components of that movement that could be potentially dysfunctional. That dysfunction could be breaking down the ability to actually, learn better movements of subsequent patterns and shapes within that larger movement, breaking that down, isolating them, and then just being able to practice them with a greater frequency.
Yeah, and I think, like, the way I think about it too, and like, I'm just going to choose the shape of like a B stance RDL for this because I think we can adapt. What I'm about to do is like go through all these adaptations of the B stance RDL, but look at the idea of like people use Turkish Get-Up as this like capacity builder or ultimate core exercise, but it's like it's building capacity and core stabilization or strength through very specific windows in very short periods of time. But if you were to take someone from week one appropriately and responsibly as a coach with a B stance RDL and you loaded them ipsilaterally, neutral grip dumbbell ipsilateral, then you went ipsilaterally loaded semi-supinated grip. Then you went ipsilaterally loaded pronated grip. Then you went contralaterally loaded pronated, contralaterally loaded semi-supinated, contralaterally loaded neutral grip. You've actually moved them in a capacity sense through varying degrees of stability at the shoulder and load across anterior to posterior oblique sling, ipsilateral to contralateral, neutral grip to pronated grip depending on ipsilateral, contralateral load. And you've actually created a greater distance, like proximity, like proximal to distal, of anti-rotation or anti-lateral flexion or elevation depression of the shoulder, or like more or less activation of lat across posterior oblique sling through function like your deal, or through action ipsilaterally. So it's like I went through 3 grip variations and then 2 loading pattern variations of the B stance RDL. So that affords you 8 weeks of training in the B stance RDL, and I've built a greater capacity through the hip and the shoulder and through anti-lateral flexion, anti-rotation of the hip in a movement where now all I have to do with that athlete is take them from B stance to a bilateral stance, and we'll pull anything off the floor. Yeah. Whereas your guy's sitting on the floor with probably still 12 kilo kettlebell.
Yeah. I just think, and that builds out from a first principles. Like I've started to use this analogy of valence.
Yeah.
Right. So if we think of like, I don't know, it was probably 10th grade biology, 10th grade chemistry, probably more like 11th grade chemistry, where it's like you think of like helium that only really has one outer valence. It has like whatever, 1 electron or 2 electron, whatever the fuck is 1 electron. Helium, hydrogen, lithium, beryllium, boron, oxygen, whatever, so on and so forth. And there's 8 valences per ring, right? And then we move to an outer valence. Well, it's like, what is that continuum but creating a capacity at simultaneous valences at the same time, right? So, and this is difficult in the podcast. It's even more difficult if you're not familiar with like the inane mental ramblings of me and you, but like I follow it 100%, where there's a manipulation of the outer valence, which is the rotation from, pronation semi-supinated to neutral, right? That's an outer valence manipulation. And then there's an inner valence manipulation of actually what shoulder we're loading, right? So there's like there's larger dial in the middle, and then there's more finite dials on the outside that we can calibrate these two together. And by the time we've gone through, this progression of outer and inner valence rotation, we've created efficiency across all these gears, as the large gear in the middle and the smaller cogs at the shoulder, as I'd refer to as like the peripheral and central hubs of stability.
Yeah.
We create a capacity of these relative interplays across these valences. Now we've been able to actually paint, this circle around the straight line of movement. And then when we need to go to the straight line, the conventional deadlift, we have an ability to cut through any fucking which way we want.
Yeah.
You want me to pick that up? Great. Done. I can manipulate these dials, these valences, and I know a capacity, and I've learned the ability to be able to move these dials in a way, and then it becomes so simple then to just, pick that up. Okay.
Yeah, and it's bilateral, and the modality's connected, and I can create tension across my body. And I think that's where I see like the PRI model, the expansion, expansion and compression. And I look at that B stance RDL and this idea of like dropping a stone in the water, and you see the ripples come out, as you're saying, like these outer valences to something. But to me, it's like every movement I look at, I see it as a core movement with perturbations to the core movement. That's how I see every movement in the gym.
The hamstring curl is one of the classics, I think.
Yeah, so I think like the prone hamstring curl is a great example. And anything outside of a sport-specific movement, being like a barbell strength athlete, I see all, let's call them accessory or assistance or bodybuilding style movements, as perturbations of a core principle. So prone hamstring curl. Prone hamstring curl to me is essentially the dead bug / bird dog to the bear stance position or like quadruped plank to the front plank, standard plank, to the prone hamstring curl, to the single leg RDL, to the like low handle prowler push. They're all literally the same movement that starts at this anti-flexion extension moment in the core and then creates perturbations through hip flexion extension, knee flexion extension to that initial core idea of anti-flexion extension.
And I think by that logic, and this is something that, again, not to like rip on PRI, but like I think just differs in thought process. And sometimes it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, where it's like, look, I think in my logic, based off of the way we look at movement, these inner and outer valence or the ripple effect outward from the trunk and the rib cage and the pelvis, like I think both thought processes have an ultimate respect for walking and breathing, essentially, as like the driving evolutionary adaptations that create human movement. But I always think a unilateral to bilateral is the logical progression to, as you would say, build function and then express it. Where, and to my knowledge, the other side of the aisle looks at as unilateral as a progression to bilateral, which it's hard because this is where stability comes into play, and the understanding of, you know, the qualitative, subjective means by what's a qualitative?
Quantitative measures. I don't even know what
objective measures for subjective means.
Yeah, there you go. That's my quote.
I got you. Yeah, that's your quote. I just gotta go on Instagram and find it somewhere. But I think for a thought process that does not respect stability because it's not something that we quantified, I think they always struggle with qualification of movement, because the bilateral to unilateral loading does not yield the same result in quality as a progression as because you can hide so much in a broader base support in a bilateral squat pattern, in a bilateral hinge pattern, right? Even in bilateral pressing, that, you know, the sum and express sum of these parts, albeit objective, do not actually help transfer across when we move unilaterally. The opposite is true, right? If we can get these inner valences first dialed in, we can start to worry about, you know, anti-rotation, lateral flexion, and anti-flexion extension at the core, right? Or organizing, as you'd say, like the rib cage with the pelvis. All of a sudden, your ability to layer on top of that and start to calibrate these outer dials for shoulder and hip, and then just manipulate distance from center of mass. Then when we've sort of done this calibration process across all these gears, or, you know, across these valences, and, you know, you even went a step further to add knee flexion extension. We could look at elbow flexion extension. We could look at wrist flexion extension as ripples out from this core rib cage pelvis organization that we, you know, our central hub of stability. You know, a deviation in our ability to anti-laterally flexion extend, and anti-rotate is going to manifest, right? And not necessarily the other way around, right? Like we can hide a lot of inefficiencies at that central core, that stone in the middle of the ripple effect, that we can't not necessarily analyze when we just, like a quad extension can't tell me what's wrong at the pelvis necessarily, right? But something wrong at the pelvis could tell me an issue with the knee, or why I'm having an issue with the knee. I think anyone with a clinical sense can look at it that way. So like understanding, at least trying to have your own, whether it's the way we think or the way others think, having some consistency in the way you look at progressions. And I think from a transferability standpoint, you know, I don't see the retrograde benefit of moving from bilateral to unilateral, but I always see the anterograde benefit of moving from unilateral to bilateral.
Well, bilateral for me, it's like, again, it comes to like efficiency rating and modality and intention. If I'm moving bilaterally, my goal is to always create the most force production possible, whether that's velocity or it's load on the bar. Like if I'm going to go bilateral, I'm producing force. That's all I'm doing, whatever measurement I want to use for that. So for me, it only makes sense to go unilateral to bilateral, because once I get to bilateral as a coach with an athlete, or as myself as an athlete, when I move to bilateral, I'm going in one direction. I'm doing like the weightlifting thing. The bar only goes up. The bar doesn't go down. Like at a weightlifting meet, they only load weight on the bar. They never take weight off. So if you're the heaviest lifter, you literally lift after yourself. And it's like, that's my idea in training, is like when I move to bilateral, like I'm going in one direction here. Like I better have the underpinnings that are unilateral function, which would then, based on the amount of time it took me to develop that unilateral function in that holistic sense or through all perturbations, I should have enough skill to underpin the barbell work that I can move in that one direction constantly. And the benefit of bilateral is the idea of load. The consequence of unilateral is that I can't load it the same. So when I get to bilateral, I'm doing that so I can just keep putting load on the bar, right? You would get really good like firing a gun to then be able to fire the gun from greater and greater distances, and then under greater and greater loads of stress or situation, right? Some guy who shoots a target like we did from like 50 feet away, and we had 4 hours to hit the target. Like that's not a guy.
We're not exactly Chris Kyleing it on the side of the county road in Gainesville, Florida.
Correct.
Right.
Like Chris Kyle killing 400 dudes in the middle of, you know, Afghanistan. Like this dude's at the bilateral nth degree of expressing his function behind the rifle, right? Like he goes out every day, or did, R.I.P. Chris Kyle, went out every day and expressed the function he created behind the rifle. Right. But he built that function somewhere else. Sure. So I think when people get to the barbell, you have to understand, like, dude, when you're conventional deadlifting 100, 150% of your max or 700, 800 pounds, you're Chris Kyle, man. Like, you're hitting the dude from 500 yards away. Like, you're expressing a function. Like, you better be there. You're not lining up from 4 football fields and you're like, oh, let's see how this rifle works. Like, that's not the fucking thing.
Yeah, and I think, like, based off that analogy, like, to introduce, like, training variables like density within a week or density within a session, like accumulated fatigue, rest periods, like guys who can pull 8 in a meet could show up cold and pull 7. Yeah. Right? And like that's, so, you know, if on his best day, he's whatever, like the Canadian sniper that got the guy from like 1,600 meters or something crazy like that, like a mile and a half out. Yeah. I think it may have actually been more. It might have been 1.5 miles. It was like 3-something kilometers. And his ability to do that, like you said, like you don't practice those shots. Yeah. Like when, I don't know, when Chauncey would throw up from like 3/4 court at the buzzer. Yeah. Like he's not sitting there in practice just from his own fucking free throw line lobbing these things. It's because he can calibrate that straight line between the fucking windmill dunk to the free throw, to the layup, to the fadeaway, to the fucking wilt the stilt hook. Like he just knows how to, like he's so dialed in at all points of that circle around that straight line, as you'd say, that, yeah, all right, there's 2 seconds on the clock. Dish the rock to Chauncey. He's going to throw it up for the Hail Mary. But it's like it's not as obscene a coincidence as you might think, right? Just like the guy showing up. It's not an accident that this guy can pull 7, right? So like looking at your ability to perform in variable situations, right? That's where I think a lot of people get tripped up, is they try and make everything perfect. Like I used to, like when I would compete, this is so dumb, like powerlifting examples are so stupid sometimes, but like I know that when I compete, I usually have to squat. I don't know, if I'm competing in the 275 class, maybe it's closer towards lunch. If I'm down in the 242s, maybe it's like 10 a.m., right? Meet starts at 8, women are in the weight room by 7, or in the warm-up room by 7. So the last 4 weeks of my training, maybe even longer, you know what my squat sessions are? 10 a.m. in the morning. Yeah. Because when I show up on the day, this Friday at 5 p.m. shit doesn't fly anymore. Yeah. Right? So it's like, you know, being able, but the ability for me to squat, whatever, 700 pounds at 5 p.m. is the reason I could come in and squat 700 pounds at 10 a.m. Yeah. Right? Like, and just being able to manipulate the environment to express that function, I think is something that people just get so tripped up with. And that's, like, it's so funny to me in writing the PSL1 manual and cross-referencing it with other books in the space. Like Supple Leopard is always one that comes up. And to me, it's just so antithetical because, like, if you think of the leopard isn't sitting there with a lacrosse ball. Yeah. Right? Like, it is never a victim of its environment. Right? Like, it is able to control its environment. It's just up and ready to go. Like, get ready so you don't have to stay ready. And I think that, or stay ready so you don't have to get ready. And I think that's, for me, one of the logical underpinnings in the progression from unilateral to bilateral is like, look, if I can do all this shit when I just have to go pick it up, and like you said, oh, the medium is now contained within a barbell, yeah. Like you have to use both my hands and both my legs, like you're letting me off the rails here. Like you're telling me there's the antelope, go. And it's like, okay, fuck, I'll supper level the fuck out of this. Right, where we look at the regression, what I would consider regression from bilateral to unilateral, I just don't see that transferability. No,
it's like the same thing. Like we went to Florida, and like we like rocked off the plane, and we went into hybrid. Like shout out hybrid for letting us use the gym, and I finally got to use like calibrated plates and a real bench again. And it's like I just like pause squatted 85% and then benched over 300 pounds, yeah. And like I don't do bench press, but it's like there's a capacity that allows me to express that function because it's like doing weightlifting, doing overhead kettlebell movements, doing pull-ups every day ad nauseum and expressing this capacity overhead through shoulder flexion, external rotation. It's like then to lay on a bench that's ultimately external supported and press something in a horizontal plane where my entire body weight stacked now beneath it, not behind it, is like, well, this is nothing. Like the expression of skill in this movement is so much lower. It's like now the progressive overload, now the perturbation to movement is solely load. But we see people that train bilaterally, they're trying to express function with a means that expresses load.
Right. They're trying to build function
with the
by
means
expressing by expressing function.
Yeah.
Would I have gotten that right? They're trying to improve function by expressing function.
Exactly. And
where if you improve function, you can better express function.
Exactly. And I kind of think about it like trying to like karate chop like a bunch of plywood. Okay. And it's like, just stay with me.
Let's go.
Like, I get that guys can cut through like 10 fucking pieces of wood that are cut the wrong way and whatever. But it's like, imagine I had to break one piece of wood. Imagine I had to break 3 pieces of wood. Why the fuck would I not want to break one piece of wood?
Right.
But it's like people lay on a bench press, and all of a sudden, because they don't have that previous capacity built, it's like, dude, they're trying to press extreme amounts, 70+% load. They're trying to express function that they maybe only have 70% of. They're trying to do it for reps, and now they're doing time. And then they're going close grip, and now they're doing distance. Yeah. And it's like, dude, you're fighting so many enemies here, man. Like, you're blocking left and right. Yeah, it's like,
drop a piece of paper.
Yeah, it's like, dude, you squat at 10 a.m. and like the function of your hips at 242 plus pounds. It's like you're only fighting against the load that is on the bar.
Right.
You got somebody else who bilateral is their initial means of entering into this space, and they're fighting through all those tenets of progressive overload, plus now the function component. It's me doing 1 rep of bench press. It's like I'm literally fighting against 300 pounds, not where my elbow sits in scaption, not where my shoulder sits in retraction, depression. You know what I mean? It's not where my wrist sits in flexion extension because I overpronate all the movements I do. It's like I sit down and I lock into this movement pattern, and it's like I'm only fighting against now the load on the bar. I'm not competing against all these kind of invisible enemies of the movement.
There's no turbulent flow that exists from the center ripple of function outward to, and like as we kind of mentioned, the outer periphery of ankle to wrist, which if you think about a proper bench press is kind of how the whole thing. So the idea that this system has been built in such a fluid manner that there is no turbulent backflow, which is going to then add undue resistance, undue inefficiencies. And I think the only way to be able to have that expression of not like with no turbulence and the idea of this inefficient sort of backflow into a system of like applying more load is to go from this inner valence, outer valence, and just understanding like the very simple gear shifts that occur between these two inner outer valences of like how the shoulder, or with the hip, right? We use the B-stance RDL example and talk about like the ability of the shoulder, but the same thing could exist with the lower body, right? Like how is it that we manipulate, hip rotation in various degrees of flexion, in various degrees of pelvic tilt? They're just that alone, hip flexion extension, rotation at the hip, pelvic tilt. We've sort of equated for the 3 degrees of movement, and the progression just exists in the 4th dimension of time. It's like, okay, I do not see how that is a refutable thought process when it comes to training, but more importantly, I think to acquiring the skill and retaining the skills of training.
Yeah, like I think like I think just something like a good thought process or a way of looking at it. It's something that we talk about in the skill acquisition course a lot, is like this idea of like schemas. Like in order to learn a skill, there has to be a schema. And the idea behind like schema learning or schema experiences, there's cognition and there's perception. Cognition is knowing, perception is past experience. So like cognition is understanding facts and analyzing an environment, and perception is all based on past experience. Well, that idea of moving bilateral to unilateral, I can't go from conventional deadlift to single leg RDL because I have no real concept of how my hips work, and I have no past experience of being in an unstable environment. So to think about having to, again, acquire skill in an expensive environment, that's an expensive transition to make. Now, single leg RDL to conventional deadlift is a far less acquisition of skill, a far less expensive acquisition of skill, because I have the cognitive side of things. If I understand how the hips work in internal, external rotation, abduction, adduction with one another in an unstable environment, and I have the perception, having been in an unstable environment in a hip hinged position where I'm at a mechanical disadvantage to express force, and now I put myself into an environment where I start over calibrating to the single leg RDL, but I'm in a far more mechanically advantageous environment. So it's like I have the cognition and the perception from single leg RDL that I now transfer to conventional deadlift. I build no real perception of space in the conventional deadlift because there's a kinesthetic cue. Yeah. And kinesthetic cueing, although the most regressive, is the least apt at building proprioception because it creates an environmental constraint. It changes the environment. And then my learning is going to be stunted.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think that idea of kinematic proprioception, like, you know, in the baseball space, watching you and Kyle Rogers, shout out Kyle Rogers,
Yeah.
just real quick. KL Rogers,
What a beauty.
Mr. Rogers. It's a wonderful day in the neighborhood whenever you get to talk to Kyle Rogers. You think we rant about shit? Shouts out Kyle Rogers. But, like, this idea of motion capture. Like, I love this idea, and, like, actually some of the new prescript design is based off of, like, motion capture art. I love this idea that, you know, at the joint, and another issue I have with, like, and again, I don't want to flame PRI. I just think there's a border that I think we both exist on in hyper complexity and over simplification, where we might look more to the end of hyper specificity sometimes, and we need to check ourselves to make sure that, look, can we draw logical conclusions in the exercises that we choose for the reasons that we choose them, right? And I think the border there in looking at, like, oversimplification and hyperspecificity is, like, this idea that muscles are dumb. So I have such an issue with this because, like, I look at, like, Golgi tendon organ and muscle spindles primarily as our brain's way of creating internal motion capture. These are the muscles, musculotendinous junction, Golgi tendon organs, muscle spindles. They are neurological tennis balls on the latex suit making Smeagol for Lord of the Rings, right? So it's like this idea that I think in an oversimplified model that looks at movement devoid of stability, devoid of the importance of unilateral movement, and the subjective improvements leading to objective means, the unilateral builds the bilateral, the central hub of the spine, helps improve the peripheral hubs at the shoulder and calibrating these two gears, the center ripple. However, whatever fucking crazy bullshit analogy we've come up with to describe this principle, I think on the flip side of that, in the oversimplified state where we see what I would say a regressive thought process from bilateral to unilateral, it's like they don't respect the muscles' neurophysiology in creating this motion capture and proprioceptive awareness. Like you said, like, look, if my hip doesn't know how to work when one hip has to hinge, how can both hips know how to work when both hips have to hinge, right? When performed with a task in isolation, they can't perform it. What and where, this idea of the path of least resistance, what is creating this if the hip is not capable, and we haven't built that capacity to express that capability, right? So I just think, like, in making sure that from oversimplified to hyper-specific, you know how to draw the boundaries of where we're going too far in one direction. Because I think this is where we draw these 2 points, and then however we want to draw these straight lines, as your analogy would express, between that we're able to do so.
Yeah, agreed.
Scene. All right, that's it. We're going to record the intro now.
Yeah.
Let's do that, because that was... I think I just need that for my own sake. I'm gonna leave this in because I need to just talk. I need to talk about what the fuck we just talked about, as per usual.
Yeah.
I usually take like 10 minutes after we record a podcast to just like, whoa, because we've done drugs.
Yeah.
And it's like having conversations like this is what it's like when we take drugs and we don't say anything to anyone.
Yeah.
We just sit in coffee shops really worried that everyone knows. Anyways, that's it. We'll see you guys on the other side.